Thanks everybody for joining. Pleasure to have Florence Hudson join us today at the MedISAO webinar. Florence is the Executive Director at the Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub at Columbia University, among many other things. I've known Florence for many, many years, and over the past few years had the pleasure to work on the extended team that Florence put together to develop the IEEE UL 2933 standard working group, and which was led by Florence. And she will walk us now through the background of the standard, some of the technical detail, and hopefully in the end we have some time left for Q&A. And with that, Florence, please take it from here.
Thank you so much, Axel. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to virtually meet you all. I look forward to potentially working with you in the future on areas around clinical Internet of Things and medical devices and TIPPSS. So first, we'd like to start with something that you probably all know, is why do we care? Why are we worried about this? Well, all these new advanced technologies enable digital transformation, which is the term like all executives can use, but we know that it can increase risk because you have all these new attack vectors, IoT devices, new systems like blockchain, machine learning, AI, a lot of little data making big data, augmented reality, all sorts of things that are going to be happening and already are there. And so all these attack vectors are the things that we worry about. Next slide, please. So as you look at this in a connected healthcare paradigm, we leverage these advanced technologies and data to improve insights and outcomes. We want to learn more about what's going on with the patient, with their environment. We have information from connected healthcare devices and data, clinical care data, environmental data. I say, as I live in New York, when there were the wildfires in Canada a year or two ago, I had to get, something to put in my living room because I could taste the smoke from British Columbia, and so we're exposed to all these exposomes, as they call it, patient lifestyle data, clinical and fundamental research data, which creates a compendium of healthcare data that is very attractive to bad actors. And what we need to do is protect it more and protect the humans, the data, the devices, and the institutions in connected healthcare. Next slide, please. So, as we said, more devices and data can be great for insights and outcomes, but they create more security and privacy attack vectors and risk. And Dr. Suzanne Schwartz at the US FDA said any medical device connected to a communications network like Wi-Fi or public or home internet may have cybersecurity vulnerabilities that could be exploited by unauthorized users. And patients and providers and some people, might not be aware. They might think, oh, when I'm at home, I'm safe. No, not necessarily. You're really never safe. And so what we want to do is reduce the risk. Next slide, please. So increased connectivity brings increased risk. What could possibly go wrong? A lot of things. So the FDA is actually identifies, vulnerabilities, and they actually have been identifying software vulnerabilities as far back as 2008 for personal medical devices. In 2017, they recalled 465,000 pacemakers due to cyber hacking fears. Many of you probably were aware of that. Hackers could reprogram 20 types of devices with adjacent access and low skill level. Like, within, 15 meters or 50 feet. And I'll say to people, when you're in an airport or you're in a movie theater, you're in a mall, or you're anywhere, how many people are within like 50 feet of you that you can trust? There's always going to be a risk. And low skill level. So we really have to worry about this. Then there were voluntary recalls of certain internet connected programmers for implantable cardiac devices and insulin pumps. And then there was a recent one that Axel is going to talk about, if you'd like to mention the 2025 FDA alert.
Yeah, so we added that literally last minute to the presentation here because it is indeed highly relevant. So this is a particular model of a patient monitor, and FDA and CISA issued an alert because of multiple security vulnerabilities, one of which opening up a back door into the patient monitoring system from a hard-coded IP address, which pointed to a university in China. Obviously, that is a high sensitivity topic. Initially, it was positioned as a malicious attempt to plant such a backdoor. further research has since then, um, I think, demonstrated that this was really more of a poor engineering decision, a poor design decision that was made during the development of this particular device, rather than a malicious IP address that could be used as a backdoor. Nevertheless, it is still a backdoor, right? It's not a matter of whether it was put there maliciously or through stupidity, excuse my language. But also those researchers that made this last conclusion did show that very similar issues exist actually with other patient monitors from other manufacturers. So clearly, medical device manufacturers are still, unfortunately, suffering from the sins of the past, where in a much simpler security world, these decisions maybe were benign, but unfortunately, in the world we live in today, they are of great concern, and hence back to that recent alert by FDA and CISA. Back to you, Florence.
Thank you, Axel, for sharing that. So, what we're looking to do is to create more awareness about these risks and then action to reduce the risks. Next slide, please. So we must secure connected healthcare devices and data while also enabling interoperability so we have the insights to improve better outcomes and to help protect the humans. Our top concerns are connected healthcare devices and data because when you hack one of those devices, you could immediately kill a human. Our next concerns are connected hospitals, campuses, cities, and vehicles because you can quickly kill a human. And also clinical, scientific, and research device and data integrity. During the beginnings of the COVID pandemic, one of the large research universities, their research was hacked. So what could go wrong with that? Well, they could take the research or they could change it. And then if decisions are being made on bad research data, that has longitudinal effects. So all of these things can happen, and what we want to do is reduce the risk. So we need protection for devices, hardware, software, and service hacks. We want to reduce physical health and safety risk, financial risk, reputational harm. You know, I didn't mention which devices, what companies the devices were on the other FDA page. You can easily find it though. And it does impact, you know, the reputation of the firm. And these are not just cute little companies that are creating new devices and never had to worry about security and privacy before. These are companies that you know and trust. And so we all have to do this. We also want to reduce data theft, stop data integrity issues and loss of privacy, and create a real defense in depth strategy, hardware, firmware, software, and service level. And we need to evolve policy and culture to expect this. So this is actually in 2015, I was still a VP back at IBM. And I was working on the Internet of Things strategy, actually working with ARM. Like we were up in the cloud, they were down, you know, in the IP of the design of the chip and the device and everything in between. And we said, you know, they're going to try to hack everything. And you really have to have design in security and privacy right from the beginning. Next slide, please. So we created TIPPSS, the prior one, please. So we started talking about this at a Cisco IoT World Forum Steering Committee meeting in like 2015. And that one is great. Oh, it seems like it has a mind of its own. Sorry, Axel.
Apologies, my
Maybe it
mistake.
doesn't. That's okay. Maybe it has an automatic thing. I'm sorry, it has that. So we were at a Cisco IoT World Forum Steering Committee meeting, and another gentleman who works with IEEE as well, he was from ST Micro originally, we were saying nobody's worrying about end-to-end trust and security. Nobody's worrying about it. Everybody's just worrying about their device or their software or their application or their use case. We need a comprehensive view here. And so we worked together and we hosted an end-to-end trust and security workshop for IoT at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. We had a lot of the agencies there. We had NSF, we had DOE, we had DHS, we had some of the other three-letter agencies, industry, academia, nonprofits, and standards people. And we created this vision for TIPPSS. So we see TIPPSS as the new cybersecurity paradigm. We see this as the next turn of the crank beyond CIA, you know, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which was really created at the enterprise and nation state perspective. This is talking about devices being in humans and humans being in devices and the additional safety risks. trust, identity, privacy, protection, safety, and security risks. So first we have the IAM world, identity and access management, for those of you who talk like that. So trust and identity, allowing only designated people and services to have device or data access, validating the identity of the people so you know you can trust them, in an IAM world. Privacy, protection, safety, and security. So this is the new paradigm that we see is very complementary and an extension to the CIA world. Next slide, please. So after we had this initial meeting, and there's a workshop report you can see. When you go to the IEEE website, it looks like it's a firewall, but it's just because they want you to sign in so they know who's downloading this stuff. You don't have to pay to see this. But we did, there's a report from that effort in 2016, and then we created a pre-standards effort with IEEE. And as part of that, we created a TIPPSS framework for clinical IoT data and device interoperability. So for those of us geeks, we're comfortable with all of this. It can scare other people, but we have to worry about all this stuff. We have to make sure that it's secured at every level. So it's the UX, UI, applications, integration, Fire, HL7, all the other things that exist. As they say, the wonderful thing about standards is there's so many of them, but they're out there in the world. So we have to make sure that we're collaborating and interoperating APIs, software development kits and application programming interfaces. If there's DLT, blockchain or distributed ledger technology, the connection layer, data ingest and management, and all the data sources and targets on chain and off chain. At the time, we were having a blockchain discussion as well. And on the right, you can see with the green going up and down, those are all the elements that are part of TIPPSS: security, encryption, federated identity management, key management, all of this. And so this is also available from IEEE. And this creates the vision of what are all the things we have to worry about. And these are changing all the time, right? And especially all the data sources and targets on the bottom. Next slide, please. So after we did the pre-standards effort, we decided, they said, do you want to create a standard effort? We said, sure. Sounds like I had never led one before. And so we started this in 2019. And they asked us, when you create a project authorization request, a part of IEEE, they ask, so how many people will be in this working group? And I said, oh, like 25 if I invite my best friends. We had over 300 people that were part of this working group. And if you read the standard, you'll see there are actually 184 voting members that we had. So the thing is, when you talk about this and say end-to-end trust and security, trust, identity, privacy, protection, safety, and security, all devices, services, and software, people in that market look at you with laser beam eyes and say, I'm in. So we had people from, 6 continents, 30 countries, a lot of different organizations. And the goal with this was to establish this framework with TIPPSS principles for clinical IoT, data and device validation, interoperability. It includes wearable clinical IoT, interoperability with healthcare systems like EHRs, EMRs, other clinical IoT devices, in hospital devices, and future devices in connected healthcare systems. And you might say, how do you know it's in the future? And we'll say, well, we don't know exactly, but we know some of the things that are coming down the pike, that are, more standards or new technologies like, quantum or, changes in encryption and identifiers and all sorts of stuff. So as we're creating this, we have a lot of really smart people like Axel. And we say, I'm an aerospace engineer by training, I say there's a head down display and a heads up display, so this is what we have today, but where could this be going? So as we developed the standard, we had an eye toward making it extensible for the future. And so the working group was launched in 2019. It was approved by IEEE and Underwriters Laboratories in 2024. Published, we were awarded the IEEE Emerging Technology Award, which we're very grateful for. And now we're developing a maturity model so that people can start where they are and then see, where they are on the different elements of TIPPSS and what they want to go after first and how it all works together. And we have this new IEEE TIPPSS roadmap group, and you can join the team if you want. So the way it works in IEEE is when you have a working group, you're working on a standard. When the standard is published, you can't have a working group anymore because you're not working on it. We were like, oh, but we love each other and we have to keep working on this. So we changed this to this roadmap group, and now we are spawning new TIPPSS standards opportunities. Next slide, please. So I'll just go through some sample use cases, and these are not the only use cases. We've been presenting this at HIMSS for the last few years. I presented it at the cybersecurity conference that they have like on day one before the big thing happens a few years ago. I keynoted that, and then I presented a couple more times, and people one time they said, "Oh, these are the only use cases." I'm like, "No, that's not the idea. These are sample. This is just to give people a feel for, so where would this apply?" And it's like pretty much everywhere. So the ones we decided to choose in the standard in the back as samples are connected monitoring device, in this case, a continuous glucose monitor, connected therapy device, in this case, connected automated insulin delivery system. And we chose the diabetes care paradigm because it really applies to so many different, human constituencies. Hospital at home, which became more prevalent during COVID, and home to hospital. So now I'm just going to kind of blow through these. Axel, next slide, please. So for the first one, you can see here's Caroline. She's running. She has her glucose sensor on, and you can see the user view and the technical view. And so that's what we encourage people to do as you look at what your use cases are for your clients or you're creating devices or this whole solution view. How is the user interacting with this, and what's the technical back end that you have to worry about? Here you can see the personal area network, Bluetooth Low Energy, near field communications, LAN, WAN, all this other different stuff. So figure out how this is actually all going to work together. Next slide, please. The next one is the connected automated insulin delivery system. Here you can see there's a glucose center insulin pump through the AID controller, and then to the endocrinologist in the back, and then the technical side on the right. And there could be, AI algorithms that are in here too. There are actually over 50 AI standards working groups right now in IEEE. So we decided to wait till all that kind of evolves and matures a little bit before we put too much about specifics in AI, but we refer to that, it can be part of the solution. Next slide, please. The next one is hospital at home. Here you see Jan, with, oxygen sensor, temperature sensors, infusion devices, blood pressure monitors, laboratory devices with an aggregator gateway, and then, connecting into, a patient surveillance application, a patient status monitor, their doctors being able to look at it. Next slide, please. And this would be part of it, for those of you who work with, SIEM or security, information, and event management. We peppered a couple of technical things in here so you can see some of the technical depth that's in the standard. And so when if you join the TIPPSS Roadmap Task Group, actually, you can get an N-1 copy, as we say in technology, of the standards, so you can help us build, new standards elements, and you would see more of the detail behind this. Next slide, please. And then the last sample use case, we had home to hospital. So, poor Jan was over there. Now, look, here's Pauline. And so she's actually had the same situation going on, but now she's going to the hospital. So how do you maintain all the data? How do you make sure it's still secure, the privacy? They're at home, they're in an ambulance, they're in the hospital, and looking at the interoperability. Next slide, please. So that's an overview of some of the sample use cases. The other thing we have in the standard is we created this tripod view, we call it. So it's like a triumvirate of people, organizations, and devices, because they're all part of this picture of trust and identity, privacy, protection, safety, and security. So here you can see a view of trust and identity interactions in the CIoT hospital at home use case. You can see patient onboarding, caregiver onboarding, healthcare practitioner onboarding, all the things you have to worry about. Next slide, please. Then this is organization. So at the organization level, the manufacturer onboarded, the different elements here. So this probably sings to a lot of you. Next slide, please. And then we have the devices or the things, how are all of those, brought into the system in trust and identity. So you can see device identity established, registration. You can see the devices onboarded, you can provision, deprovisioning, all these different elements, and all of that's in the standard as well. Next slide, please. So that was an overview. So now I'm going to hand it back to Axel, who's going to take us through some of the technical detail. Axel?
Yeah, thanks, Florence. Great overview and also great background on why that standard actually exists and why we need it, right? I think for me, one of the big differences comparing 2933 to other standards is the comprehensive approach it took, right? It is actually north of 100 pages. But it is not just another standard. I think it's really taken a new approach to address all relevant elements of a very complex and continually evolving topic. So next couple of slides are going to just talk through some of the technicalities behind those 6 TIPPSS elements, right? So trust and identity being some of them. And basically, the standard took a broad approach to the concept of trust, right? It is not just trust between the user and the device, or patient and their device, or between devices. It is really a quite broad view of trust, including, for example, the manufacturing process, right? How can a medical device manufacturer, for example, trust that the chips and the software going into the device are not adulterated, are not compromising the integrity of the device, and so forth. So really taking those general security concepts and apply them to the real world. You're a medical device manufacturer, you're designing, you're manufacturing, and you're shipping to your customers. Well, what role does trust and identity play during all of those stages? And talk about these challenges and complexities there. And then breaking down the concept of trust and identity in both a macro and a micro view. Macro view being, for example, the software layer, or the actual trust and identity layer, which identifies and authenticates users, provides the context of the user's actions and so forth, but also things like onboarding. And then the micro view, right, the inside of the device. How does the device conceptually trust the individual components in the device, the sub-assemblies that may come from a contract manufacturer? How do you trust your software supply chain, and so forth? So again, taking a very comprehensive approach across the 6 TIPPSS principles. For the actual connectivity of a device, and this goes back to the use case slides Florence showed earlier. This is an example on how trust and identity may apply as an example across a very complex use case of a patient in a remote location. Patient connects via a medical device, a wireless network, across a gateway, a wired network that is most likely public, and then connects to a caregiver network, and ultimately then via a workstation or handheld device to a caregiver. Right? So what role does trust and identity play in this multi-hop connectivity scenario? Again, fleshed out in great detail in the standard. Another topic we tackled was privacy, and mainly dealing with the 6 key elements of privacy. Right? There are certain data protection frameworks around the world. We have HIPAA here in the US, we have GDPR in Europe. In some cases, even we have regional standards and laws, like California, for example, like Colorado, Massachusetts. And we try to kind of not necessarily interpret all of those laws and regulations, but look at common themes and how to apply those common themes to a device and to the device that is being operated by a manufacturer, maybe including a cloud backend and other services provided. We dove into concepts like privacy by design, looked at the data lifecycle, the whole process of data gathering, sharing, processing, retention, destruction, the concept of a privacy impact assessment. But how do you understand the privacy risks that come out of your device, the device's infrastructure, the way you have implemented and made design decisions? Talk about various privacy solutions that can be applied. And then, of course, lastly, the context, right? Privacy is always about context. I mean, the old story is, the privacy requirements for your cafeteria menu is very different than the privacy requirements for example, patient data on the medical device. And so clearly context is important. And again, we reflected that in 2933. Protection, it is basically about protection, certainly of the device itself, right? Because any incident on a device can lead to harm to the device, but certainly also then data on the device or transmitted by the device's environment. But if you think about things like radiation emitting devices, for example, or heat emitting devices, and then of course the humans that use the device, the patients or the operators of a device. And then of course it ties back again to the trust principles, right? Because in order to implement protection, we need things like authentication, access control, we need secure communication, and so forth. So the 6 TIPPSS principles, they all stand on their own. They have their own core requirements, but they all relate to each other. And we've spent many hours in many calls debating that relationship between the 6 principles. Safety is, of course, maintaining the devices and the larger systems safety. Make sure that we maintain effectiveness, reliability, security, consideration of direct and indirect patient safety impact. Right? Direct, that is, of course, somebody hacking into a device and changing certain parameters, dosages, diagnostic results, whatever, but also indirect harm due to device availability or lack thereof, where patients may need to be sent to other hospitals or care is delayed, as we have seen it with, for example, ransomware attacks in hospitals across the globe, WannaCry at the NHS in the UK, the recent pathology service provider that was compromised in London that had impact on care delivery and so forth. So a broad range of how actually device security events can have direct and indirect implications on patient safety. And we know now through research that that is not only happening during the security ongoing event, but also after the event, recovery, additional security measures put in place that may delay care maybe by minutes, but still have measurable impact. And we also know from studies that there's a regional impact. If one hospital is shut down because of a ransomware attack, the other hospitals need to deal with a higher patient load, which then demonstratively leads to an increase in mortality rate. So we're not getting into the clinical aspects necessarily in the 2933 standards, but we're certainly getting into the technical considerations on how, again, patients could directly or indirectly be harmed, and certainly also how the operational environment can impact and compromise safety. Things like air quality, temperature, in an operating theater, temperature of a organ or blood fridge, and so forth. So again, many scenarios discussed, excuse me, in the standard. One of the subgroups I was leading dealt specifically with security practices, and after analyzing the many different ways how you could slice and dice security, I think we came up with a fairly simple way of looking at it. One requirement is certainly that a device needs to meet a security baseline, like take a risk-based approach to security. Certainly, your insulin pump has very different security requirements than a simple thermometer, for example. Think about your overall secure development lifecycle. Think about security engineering practices and principles, secure by design, risk controls and traceability of those controls. Make sure that you're mitigating the risk, but also that the mitigation you implied is actually demonstratively working. And then secure the device ecosystem. And that means your development, your engineering environment, your manufacturing environment, your transportation environment, should that be applicable for a given type of devices. But then you get into post-market, as the FDA calls it. You need to maintain the device's security baseline, right? You need to make sure that you have a device that is designed for security, resilience, and maintainability. Make sure you gather security data from the device across your deployed infrastructure and device population. that you manage vulnerabilities, you monitor your supply chain, and then that you update and maintain devices accordingly. The next one we came up with is the requirement that a device needs to be able to communicate securely. Whether your standard of choice is DICOM or HR7 or something more proprietary, either way, you need to protect the communication data, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data in the larger system. And that may be a simple, east-west communication between devices, but it also may be north-south communication from the device to, for example, a cloud-provided infrastructure. So either way, protect data in transit, design secure APIs, have secure end-to-end communication. That goes back to that trust diagram we had up earlier. And again, tying security back to trust and identity, right, which needs to be assured, so we can also assure authenticity between users and devices, but also devices and backend functions. But then lastly, and that is one that is often overlooked, is the device should be capable to communicate about security. Right? So a device on a hospital network or home network, we should be able to query that device and understand its security properties. The version of the software being the most basic ones, but certainly many other ones come to mind that could be important for a given type of device. We should be able to assert the device's security status. Is it operating, for example, in a fail-safe mode right now, or is it in normal operation? Are there recently detected security events in the log file that I should know about, and so forth? Ideally, a device should be integrated with the larger security ecosystem, right? Your SIEM and SOC and other security systems that either the manufacturer or the hospital or third party may operate. Certainly event and error detection, but also exception handling. How do you handle, for example, an authentication failure between two devices, between a user and a device? Depending on the type of device, do you provide a break the glass feature, or do you lock out a user if they can't provide the right credentials? That depends on the clinical use case and the exact nature of what the device is supporting clinically. And then lastly, certainly security documentation and updates as part of the communication of between you, the manufacturer, and the operator of the device. So if you look at this 2x2 matrix, right, the two on the top are device related, right? They are really design features of your device and things that should be designed into your device. The two at the bottom are interoperability related, meaning related to the device's integration with a larger ecosystem, whether that is clinical or technical. And then similar to the two on the left, those are pre-market activities, right? Those are design and engineering decisions you make during your pre-market phase, during the design of the device. Whereas the two on the right, those are post-market activities, things you need to make sure your device can support and your organization and your processes can support post-market. So a different view of the same 2x2 here is meeting a security baseline. What does that mean? Secure by design, exposure minimization, right? Don't provide interfaces that are not needed. Make sure that your calibration and test ports you need during manufacturing are closed and not show up accessible in fielded devices and so forth. Make sure you have the right security tools and technologies, and that those tools and technologies are validated and are secure by themselves, especially in today's AI world, where more and more devices use AI features, right? Your, for example, training data set is part of your pre-market activities. Well, if your training data set is compromised, that leads to a compromised AI algorithm that then is a compromised device, right? So securing anything you use pre-market is as important as securing the device itself in the post-market. And then, of course, supporting documentation, as in software bill of materials, your risk traceability, right? I defined a security risk, I implemented a control, I tested to make sure that the control does address the risk as intended, and I document all of that. But also then, of course, user instructions related to security. Maintain the baseline. That's all about supply chain risk management. Make sure you monitor your supply chain for new vulnerabilities, communicate new vulnerabilities to your customers, update and patch as needed, and then proper end of life, end of support management, and communication to your customers. Communicate securely, apply encryption best practices, implement wherever possible end-to-end encryption. Right, we had that trust diagram earlier with the long communication chain. Well, you could secure and encrypt each individual step. Right, I mean, you could use TLS and your home Wi-Fi security and, but you have no control over that, and you can't assure that in each case the latest standard and protocol is applied and that systems are updated accordingly. So therefore, end-to-end encryption becomes a relevant consideration. Secure provisioning, right? Encryption needs keys and certificates. Well, how do you get those keys onto devices securely so that they're not compromised, neither the way they're stored on the device nor during the provisioning process in manufacturing, especially if you work with contract manufacturers, right? They may put the keys onto your devices on your behalf. Well, how do you make sure that those devices don't get compromised while the device is not under your control? And then certainly avoid deprecated encryption protocols. Certainly, as we are entering the area of post-quantum cryptography, that becomes a really important consideration because we only got a few years left to pivot on that one here. And then, of course, key and algorithm lifecycle management. But keys may get compromised, may have a defined lifespan and need to be replaced in fielded devices, but you also may have to replace cryptographic algorithms on fielded devices at some point in the future. And then lastly, communicate about security, right? Version transparency. How do your users know which version of the device they are operating on the network? How do they know which version of your SBOM matches the version of the device they have, and so forth? Then event detection and logging, security ecosystem integration, and event logging again, because it's so important. Sorry, I missed that one. And then, yeah, forensic and audit support, right? A security event happened, you identified it, you logged it, make sure your device captures enough data so that you can reconstruct what happened during the event and why the event happened. Obviously, that is easier with a computer-like piece of capital equipment than it is, for example, with an insulin pump or something like a pacemaker. Yeah, and in the 2933 standard, there are also a number of implementation reference examples in addition to the use cases. Here's, for example, an architecture example on how the security considerations and the TIPPSS considerations in 2933 could be translated to a secure device architecture. And I want to dive into details here, but it covers everything from the actual technology all the way over to your security governance, including the standards, policies, guidelines, processes you apply while you develop your devices. And with that, I'm handing back to Florence.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Axel. Axel played a very important part in the standard working group and helping us get real about all these different elements. So thank you so much for that, Axel. So as we look forward now, I don't know how many of you have been involved in IEEE standards efforts. This was my first one, actually. So I learned a lot. So the left hand side of this shows like the life cycle of a standard working with IEEE. You initiate the project. It starts with a PAR study group, a project authorization request study group. You mobilize the working group, draft the standard, ballot it, gain final approval, and then you maintain it over time. And from the maintenance perspective, one of the things we talk about is that 802.11 is our role model. Like 802 was created years ago, and now it keeps evolving and growing and splintering in different directions to create more value. And that's what we hope happens with 2933 and TIPPSS. So we've started the opportunity to initiate new projects. So we evolved the 2933 working group to this TIPPSS roadmap task group, which allows us to keep going and actually help spawn new potential TIPPSS related standards. So the first one is going to be clinical in the clinical IoT subdomain, so maybe a 2933.1, which would be remote subject monitoring for decentralized clinical trials. And so that study group is being formed right now. So the bigger spawning group is the task group, TIPPSS Roadmap task group, and then we're spawning these little study groups. And actually, we're going to be reviewing this with the IEEE Engineering and Medicine Biology Society Technical Standards Committee in our next meeting to get approval to create this study group so they can create a PAR and then, see if we can get that approved. And then that would turn into the working group and the standard effort. So if any of you are interested in that, let us know. It's still early and there's plenty of time to get involved, but we'd be happy to have you. We also have a virtual workshop series with IEEE that I co-host from the Northeast Big Data Hub and being the 2933 chair with Maria Palombini, who's been the wind beneath our wings on TIPPSS since I first met her and talk about this in 2015 or 2017, maybe. So we have this virtual workshop series. We had a session on the remote subject monitoring clinical trials last year. We just had one for TIPPSS for distributed energy resources and transactive energy for the smart grid. That was on January 8th. And we're planning future ones for precision agriculture, connected vehicles, and smart cities. And the idea is to bring up the topic and then find leaders in those domains that could help build a standard around TIPPSS in those domain areas. And it was very important for us to make sure we really had people in the medical device and the clinical IoT space, when we did 2933. So Axel's a great example of that. Another is Craig Hypes. There we have a Orlando Lopez from NIH. We had somebody from Cerner, and I chaired the working group, and our two co-vice chairs were a senior technical fellow at Medtronic, chief information security officer at Indiana University Health, and our secretary is from Draeger. So people who were really in it, and so we make sure that we're doing something that's very pertinent and ingestible and digestible for the community. So if you'd like to learn more about the virtual workshops, the link is here, and we can put it in the chat if you want. Or if you want to join the roadmap study group or task group or any of these things, you can just reach out to me on LinkedIn is fine, or you can email me at florence.hudson@columbia.edu. Next slide, please. And so this is a poster that was actually created, and we presented it in an IEEE event in Boston last year, and they actually presented it at some other meetings, including where the FDA was there. And apparently the FDA came up to this and said, this is exactly what we need. We're like, oh, that's so good to hear. So this is a sample of taking the 2933 and TIPPSS architecture and then evolving it for decentralized clinical trials as a care option leveraged with hospitals at home. And so you can see like the use case model we had for 2933 in the middle here. And then you can see how they said proposing, to bring it to the clinical trials use case, remote participant monitoring, and then participant to research site. So evolving it to that new view. And so this is part of the element that we will be using, part of the elements we'll be using as we create this remote subject monitoring and clinical trials PAR study group. Next slide, please. So also, IEEE has been doing a lot of really great advertising about this standard, which we're super excited about. Actually, a year ago now, I can't believe it's that long already. They came out when they come out with this every year, and IEEE beyond standards, 4 foundational technology trends to watch in 2024. And you can see the second one there is building trust with data governance. And as Axel said, we took a broad and deep view of trust. And this actually talks about as the world becomes increasingly more digital and by extension connected, an emphasis will continue to be placed on universal human values, including the TIPPSS elements, because the humans want to make sure they can trust this stuff too. Next slide too, please. And then there are some publications to learn more about TIPPSS. The KPMG article where there was that quote in security in the IoT ecosystem that we talked about when I was still back at IBM saying they're going to try to hack everything. We have to do this at every level, defense in-depth strategy. We had another one on creating, analyzing, and sustaining smarter cities. So this brought it into the smarter cities view. A couple of IEEE articles, enabling trust and security tips for IoT, wearables, and medical interoperability with some colleagues. And then we actually have 2 Springer books, Women Securing the Future with Tips for IoT and Tips for Connected Healthcare, because I was asked to write books in the Women in Engineering and Science series. So I invited 17 women authors in each one of these to come along with me. And we have people from, GlaxoSmithKline, Cisco, Microsoft, IBM, a bunch of different places. And so there are some publications out there. And if you're actually affiliated with an academic institution, I'm so bad at selling my stuff now that I'm in nonprofit academia land, even though I was at IBM for many years. You might be able to download the ebooks for free, or the students probably can if there's a Springer link connection. Usually the libraries lead that at each of the universities. And so these are some of the publications. And of course, there's the standard itself. Next slide. And I think this is our thank you slide. So thank you so much, Axel, for inviting me to join you. Thank you, Kate, for organizing all this, and to the MedISAO team for allowing us to spend this time with you. We're really interested in your thoughts. So I see we have one question here. Axel, can you see it? How to make sure we can protect patient data?
Yeah, so that goes back to what I said about encryption, right? Protection of patient data. Obviously, confidentiality becomes a big concern, but also data integrity becomes a big concern, right? Because patient data also in the healthcare setting includes clinical data, my medical history, my medications, my allergies, and whatnot. And certainly, again, use cryptography for data at rest, data in transit, to make sure that the data is protected against compromise, unauthorized disclosure, but also unintended change, whether that is intentional or unintentional, doesn't matter. It can do harm either way.
Yeah, and we're careful in the standard not to say this is exactly how you do it, because processes and technologies can change. We say, but this is what you have to do, right? You have to make sure you're protecting data at rest and data in motion. And we also wanted to make sure we weren't specifying one specific type of technology, like, a trust zone in a chip versus whatever. So we're careful not to prioritize a single vendor or capability, but to say this has to be done. And so it leaves, an opportunity to evolve it and make it even better over time, which we're hoping, we all can. Are there any other questions? Oh, more questions. Look, they're spawning questions. Is there a relationship for this standard with the UL 2900 series? Funny, you should ask that. So I didn't tell this part of the story, but when we first created the standard, the PAR, it was 2733. And then now a little backstory here. So when I was a little girl, I used to crawl around looking for the UL tags because I'm a geek and I knew that meant that the stuff was safer. So we decided to invite UL to co-develop this standard together from the beginning. So we created an MOU with them. And when we started working with them, they said, this really isn't our 2900 series. So can you change your name? So as I say, we got married and changed our name. So UL joined us. So it was jointly developed by IEEE and UL. It was published the same day. You can buy it from IEEE or UL. It's the exact same standard. And that's why we changed it to 2933 so that it would be part of the 2900 series. Axel, did you want to add anything to that?
Maybe one thing to repeat is relative to 2900, but also many other standards that are out there. Right? The intent of 2933 was not to replace them or add something else to the mix. It was really the attempt to build a comprehensive structure across all the different aspects that are already defined by existing standards like 2900. So it's not, again, yeah, it's more a hierarchical relationship rather than a one-to-one matching relationship.
Yeah, it's meant to be complementary and part of the series and part of the family. Um,
And the same is actually true for the last question here about 81001-5-1. Right, 81001 is a development lifecycle standard, which we kind of touch on a little bit, but we talk more about the technical practicalities of things that should happen during development rather than what 81001 does, which is laying out the engineering processes that you should apply as you develop software for a medical device.
yeah, and we actually have lists of some of these complementary, standards. I think we only have two normative references. I think 27,001. I have to look in the standard. But we do refer to all of these because it's part of a whole ecosystem, right? And it isn't to replace anything, it's to create this comprehensive view, as Axel was saying, of pulling it all together. Then the other question is, can quantum analytics use case, can it protect patient data? Well, it depends, like everything else, how you deploy it. Do you want to say anything about that, Axel?
Um, so I'm interpreting the question a little bit here. I hope I'm doing that correctly. Um, and I assume you're referring to quantum computing and the risk of quantum computing to cryptography. I mean, we know that commercially viable quantum computers are within a decade, give or take, right? And that means that the cryptographic algorithms we use today that can withstand cracking by today's computers will no longer suffice in the future. And NIST actually has an entire series of documents about what they call post-quantum cryptography, meaning making recommendations about new crypto algorithms that should be used in the future that are quantum secure, and also talking about today's algorithms that really shouldn't be used anymore because they will become deprecated in the near future, especially considering the lifespan of most medical devices, which is in the range of 5, 10, 15 years, right, which gets us definitely into the post-quantum era. Now, it's easier said than done, certainly, because those quantum secure algorithms tend to be computationally heavier. They may not yet be supported by today's chip accelerators. So there are certainly some trade-off decisions and things we need to learn today in order to get on that path. But I think we need to pivot sooner rather than later.
Yes, and there is some research already going on in this space. I know there was a researcher that I worked with at Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Chakrabarty, and he was NSF funded. Now he's dean, he's very busy. Um, but it was on quantum tunneling timer technology, which could be used on medical devices. Very interesting. So, as we were saying, these are evolving technologies and they could help, but just like with anything, it depends on how you apply it. And then, as Axel said, the post-quantum cryptography and algorithms, that's in a state of flux. So it could help, but just like with anything, you have to use it the right way. And then another question is 2933 recognized as a consensus standard by the FDA? And if not, are there plans to submit it for recognition? So I have to be honest, I don't even know what that is. But it sounds like a good idea. Axel, you're probably more familiar with this than I am, are you?
Yeah. So the way FDA operates in general, and certainly also in with regards to cybersecurity, is FDA does not establish standards by itself, right? FDA establishes regulations and in the case of cybersecurity, actually guidelines. However, FDA does have a set of recognized consensus standards that gets updated a few times a year, that then basically tells device manufacturers that, hey, if you use that standard, it is recognized by FDA. Therefore, your process on going through FDA approval will be much easier because you're falling back onto something that the FDA has acknowledged as meeting their expectations. Where we are today is that, for example, UL 2900 is FDA recognized. I'm not sure if all of them, I mean, they're -1, -2, -3, but at least some of them are FDA recognized today. 2933 is not FDA recognized, but and I don't know what the process is to get that done, whether FDA hears about it, learns about it, finds it interesting, and then makes the decision, or whether a group like the standards group would pitch to the FDA. I can find out. I don't know actually.
I don't know either. So, Mark, thank you so much for asking that question. So, Axel and I will both like noodle with our ecosystem and figure out what to do. Because I know Maria Palombini, who's been our fearless leader in helping us with all this. She leads the global healthcare and life sciences practice at IEEE Standards Association. She's the one that presented that poster that I showed you on the remote subject monitoring, extending 2933 to that area and clinical trials to the FDA when she presented. She had that at one of the events where they were. So she might know something about that. And since this is an IEEE and UL joint standard, I don't know if we'd go together or it would be with UL if UL 2900 is already there. We'll have to scope some of that out too, I think, Axel.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, good question. And I think that's everything. Great. You see, Kate, I told you they wouldn't be shy. We made a couple of questions up just in case, but it's much better when you all ask so that we can help, share with you to complete your view of what you know about this, and we learn from your questions. So thank you for them. So I think we're done, Axel and Kate. What do you think?
Right on time.
Yeah, right on time. Thank you both so much for the presentation. And again, the recording will be sent out to everyone who attended. Feel free to reach out to our speakers if you have any further questions. And thank you again for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.